racial tensions. And the question I'm asking you all that's in the title is, do coalitions have a role? If we're talking about there are racial tensions within our communities, do coalitions have a role? I'll give you all a minute or two to answer that.
Seeing a lot of yeses. Aubrey says we absolutely have a role. Absolutely from Bradley. 100% we do, says Darcy. Kelly says we facilitate conversations about so many topics. This one is essential as well. Without any doubt, yes, we do. As a conduit for change and an instrument of sustainability, from Karen. I haven't seen any other comment. Yeah.
Thanks, Brittany. Thank you all for those who've answered. If you're still thinking about it, that's okay. If your answer is no, that's okay too. This space is an opportunity for us to discuss if there is a role, and if there is a role, what does that mean? And if coalitions aren't a part of the discussions, what does that also mean when we think about general population level change in the prevention of substance use misuse? And so some things to think about. Again, my name is Colbert Prosper, and really want to get into Brittany got into this coalition membership with being part of CATCA. You are connected to thousands of coalitions across the country. So definitely it's a great membership in a way in which you get to talk to other coalitions, and you don't have to reinvent the wheel because there's probably another coalition that's done it and have learned, and they're sharing it. So definitely take the opportunity to look at becoming a CATCA member. Also, CATCA supports you all in multitude of ways. CATCA has web-based resources and printed resources, so feel free to get some resources, and you'll definitely be privy to that when you're a member. And also, just in general, when you go into CATCA search box, there are some printed materials and web-based materials you all can take a look at, especially the primers. Those are clutch. Also, if you need coalition development support, it is probably the only number that I remember outside of my own. 1-800-54-CATCA, extension 240. We have coalition experts ready to answer your questions. Feel free to call them in the middle of the night. Actually, they prefer when you do that. Don't tell them I told you that. So feel free to do that. And when we think about conferences, trainings, and webinars, of course, we do webinar Wednesdays, as well as we hold two major conferences, which is the National Leadership Forum that's held in Washington, D.C. every year. And also we have our mid-year that is coming up. Please make sure to take a look at that. And that's very much, we go into like technical, more of the nuts and bolts of training and prevention in the field and what needs to be happening. So take a look at that. And last, we create customized trainings for you and your community. So if you need something that that really suits your needs, and that we here at CATCA can create that training for you. So just letting you know that we're here. CATCA trains every day, and I want to make sure that you all don't feel that you're out there by yourself, but we're here with you. A little bit about me. Some of you all know, some of you all don't. If you've heard it before, I'm sorry. And if you have heard it before, you know I'm always excited to talk about the Broward Youth Coalition. So I'm originally from Fort Lauderdale, Florida, the 954 Broward County. And I came up through the Broward Youth Coalition, and I started doing coalition work at the age of 13. So for those who have heard this slide before, this is me in high school, my senior picture when I had a whole bunch of more hair and a lot thinner. I feel like that joke does not get old. And then here with the Broward Youth Coalition, we held leadership conferences every year for the last 20 plus years for youth when we think about youth leadership. And here a couple years ago, we celebrated our 25 years. And here we have the twins, and they are now CACA trainers. They are now college students in their first year, and so they became CACA trainers. And then we have one of the youth leaders that we that was a part of our coalition, Miss Lee, and she was mentioned on BET Black Girls Rock. So when you're looking for a model on youth coalition and leadership, we've been doing it for decades. Okay, Broward Youth Coalition is the truth. It's legit, and I owe everything to my coalition. And if you didn't sense the enthusiasm, I'm going to say it. I am very, very much excited to share anything and everything about the Broward Youth Coalition. So actually, we are having our youth leadership conference next month. So looking forward to that. So our outline today, we're going to talk about the research in our field, um, also talk about Mr. George Floyd and how this spurred this conversation, and so many others who Black and Brown people been um, who have been hurt, um, killed in by our institutions. Then we're going to talk about and get into self exploration. What are your ideas and thoughts in explaining that and expanding upon that? Of course, talking about the strategic prevention framework. From there, we're going to talk about increasing community collaboration. So if coalitions do have a role, how do we make sure that is happening across our community in the ways in which we collaborate? Then I'll give you all another worksheet, and Brittany is going to give the link in the chat box, and pretty much taking a look of, all right, how do we reach common ground? How do we go about having these conversations? And as a coalition, how do we facilitate that? Questions and comments, and we'll be doing that as we go. And of course, see you later, alligator. And when you're from Florida, that is real. All right, we're jumping in right in. We don't have that much time, so um, let's do this. So what do we know? We know that historically the public health system um, in the United States is racist. And we know that people of color has been used as test subjects various times throughout American history in order for new drugs and testing. So we know everything from Lax to Tuskegee, and also what physicians were doing to slaves. So off top, we know that there are systems of oppression in our public health system. We know that racial and ethnic minority experience more health inequalities, and we can see that very much now during the pandemic and how that shows up. And I think and we know those numbers, but I don't think we understand like what that means. And so to give you an example, I have a mentor of mine, and when we think about health inequalities and how it impacts people, my mentor in a span of a few months lost a whole generation of his family. He lost his mother, his two uncles, and his aunt due to COVID. And so when we think about health inequalities, we're thinking about what does that look like on the ground and how that's impacting people. A whole generation is gone because of health inequalities. We know that here's historical trauma, and so we know that the system is oppressive, and so that includes a historical trauma, and that trauma contributes to substance dependence. We also know that perceived discrimination is a risk factor for substance use and misuse. Perceived discrimination is the idea is that the person perceives that whatever is happening is to be discrimination. Now, we can argue back and forth, it is or it isn't, but if the person perceives to be discrimination and sees that they're being treated differently because of something that they can't control, then that becomes a risk factor to substance use and misuse. We also know that ethnic race class divisions are obstacles to coalition effectiveness. And now, when we say ethnicity, and class, they're not synonyms. They're not all the same things, and they all don't show up in our communities. But definitely, when we think about coalition effectiveness, there are communities within our communities. So how that shows up, are we serving them? Are we including people in our work? And if we're not, it's definitely hurting our overall effectiveness as a coalition. And we also know that minorities encounter stereotyping during prevention and treatment efforts. So that's what we know as a field from a literature standpoint. And so as we continue to think about, do we have a role? It's all right, where does this all plays out? How does this show up in my community? So Mr. George Floyd, if some of you all didn't know, a gentleman was, and I'm not going to spend too much time on this. Gentleman was apprehended by police, and a police officer put his knee on his neck for almost 10 minutes, and in consequence, Mr. Floyd died, and that officer has been charged. And since that, there's been a global movement when we kind of think about inequalities, racial injustice, and how this shows up in our communities. And so, from that death and so many others, that a lot of people around the world has really been thinking about and having to really address what's happening in our communities. So I'm going to play a short video here. Hold on here, stop share. As I think about it, it's already 1:17. I'll play that in a little bit. Let me continue. So what are we going to do now? And Brittany is going to put the link in the chat box as we think about what's been happening in our country and also around the world, and as we are becoming more aware in raising our collective consciousness around the certain forms of oppression. What does that mean for us? What are those things? How does it show up for us? And so Brittany has put a link in a chat box, and what the link takes you to this worksheet. And this worksheet is pretty much, I would want you all to go through the first or second row, and you may want to use the George Floyd incident, or if there's something that happened in your community, take a look at that. And so what you would do is answer the question. So what was the incident? You would answer the question here, Mr. George, the death of George Floyd. What were your thoughts and feelings about the incident? You would share, I was disbelief, horrified, scared. What did it make you, why did it make you feel this way? It could happen to me, and it could happen to my family members. How did you respond, or how did you want to respond? What did I do? I reached out to my communities, and we kind of talked through that. Who can you share your thoughts and your feelings with? My family and friends. And how can you make yourself feel better? And for me, after the George Floyd incident, I reached out to Brittany and also my colleagues, or could we do something about this at CACA? And that what helps makes me feel better. And so what we're going to do is we're going to give you all about 10 minutes to work on that. And we'll come back and hear what you all have said. And DJ BH is going to be on the ones and twos and going to throw you all that classical.
All right, here it comes.
Can hear it now?
Can you hear it?
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
Five more minutes, everyone. 3 more minutes.
All right, we've got 30 seconds.
That feels like a good cutoff point in the music, Colbert.
You got it. You got it. I appreciate that, Brittany.
That was much more dramatic than I meant it to be.
It's cool. It's cool. Gets the people going. Any thoughts? Anybody want to share their thoughts? Karen, thank you so much for sharing your response in the chat box. really was moved by that and really felt that. So I appreciate you for that. Anybody, what are some takeaways? Anybody took, what are some, how did that help? How did that help you all think about your role in all of this? And where does your thoughts and feelings lie in all of this? And and I think before we decide to do anything in our communities, we've got to do that self exploration. We've got to think about, how does this make us feel? Um, which of which on the spectrum of justice, or um, where do we fall? So is this helpful to kind of have an idea of where we're going, where we're coming from, and so that way we can decide where we're going. And I do want to say that our one of our youths, Rebecca, helped me put together that worksheet. So shout out to Rebecca. Good, good, good. Thank you all for sharing. I'm gonna go back to the PowerPoint. And so the strategic prevention framework, the way in which we do our work. This is our secret sauce, but it's not so secret. This is our game plan. This is our map. This is how we do what we do. And so we know in the strategic prevention framework, before we do our work, we have to do an assessment, figure out what's happening on the ground. What are the problems? What are the conditions in our community? And then once we have our assessment together, we go into capacity building. So who do we need to help us to do the work and accomplish our goals? From there, we go into planning mode. How do we plan, and what we need to plan for? And then implementation is putting that plan into action. And evaluation is, all right, what we did and thought about, did it work? What do we need to improve? What do we need to even change a bit? And in the middle of that, in the strategic prevention framework, is sustainability and cultural competence. And so the strategic prevention framework was created by SAMHSA, adapted by CACA. And so when we think about sustainability and cultural competence in all parts of the strategic prevention framework, we're thinking about sustainability and cultural competence. And so the argument that I'm making, and I have made in our different conference session, is that cultural competence is to be on all parts of the strategic prevention framework. And coalitions are organizations that represent their communities and their community concerns. Therefore, I'd argue that coalitions are to be the most inclusive and equitable organizations in our communities. I'm going to say that again. Because cultural competence is in all parts of the strategic prevention framework, our coalitions, which are a representation of our communities and people in our communities, are to be the most equitable and inclusion centered organizations in our communities. And if that's the thought and the case, then the question is no longer do we have a role? The question is how do we show up? And we can't show up if we don't know what we're thinking and or feeling. And we don't want to process what we're thinking or feeling in front of community members, right? Because when you're doing that, you don't know what you might say, but also you want to give an opportunity and a space for your community members to share. So as we think about this work, and I'm going to play this, and I think we have some time. I'm going to play this video. I wanted to make sure we do our activities first. Hold on here. Brittany, let me know if you hear it.
Will do.
Tonight, we're on the ground in Minnesota where this all began. The country reels from its 100,000 deaths from COVID-19 and its 40 million now unemployed. We ask what this moment is telling us about America. David Grossman is in Minneapolis and his film contains distressing images of the moment leading up to George Floyd's death.
The street corner where George Floyd was killed, not by the hot, split-second decision to fire a gun, but by the cold, slow, purposeful action of kneeling on his neck for more than 8 minutes.
Bro, with your feet on his neck, man, you get off the
His nose is bleeding, like,
yeah,
come on now.
That's rough right there with his feet on his neck.
Look at his nose.
You just seeing your knee on his neck. Yeah, you got your feet.
This is one I had with my...
His 2-year-old son Xander is too young now, but in a few years, they will have what Alex calls the conversation.
It's a tough conversation to have because it's one I had with my uncles and mom forever. And it's how to, you know, properly handle yourself when approached by authorities. And it's a different conversation for us versus others.
Really? You that's a conversation you're going to have with him?
Oh, yeah, most definitely, most definitely. Because it's definitely a big difference. And it's always been that way.
The officer with his knee on George Floyd's neck is Derek Chauvin. He's been dismissed from the force and charged with third-degree murder and manslaughter. The 3 other officers who were with him but failed to intervene have been fired, but so far not charged with anything. That fact is clearly making many people here very angry.
As we all seen the video, no one else tried to help him. He couldn't breathe, 4 officers still was on top of him. So, yeah, we need justice for all 4.
Many of the shops around here and right across Minneapolis are boarded up. Chris and her family are outside their hair and nail salon. They're handing out donations of food to keep the community going until the shops can reopen, whenever that is.
Right now, these has been the most peaceful protests here. The scene of the crime, there's been a lot of peaceful protesting going on. We're pulling together, it's a lot of love. It's really emotional. Sadness, range of emotions is going on. But for the most part, like we're standing up and taking our city back.
Of course, what happened here outside the Cup Food store in Minneapolis on East 38th Street didn't stay a local news story for very long. It unleashed a wave of protest and violence that has
And so as we think about this, and that news segment was from BBC News in last year in June, what we do take from it is that people in the community are reacting. People in the community are having conversations. People in the community are showing up in various ways to deal with that particular issue, but with any community issue. And so as we think about the work as what we do as a coalition, one of our goals, and if you are a DFC coalition, is to increase community collaboration. Our role as a coalition is to be a conduit, is to be a facilitator when we're thinking about our environmental strategies on how we reduce and delay substance use and misuse. And so as we think about this work, as we think about racial injustice or other incidents, bias incidents, how do we engage our community partners? How do we begin to have that conversation? What I loved about that video is that you had a business owner already engaged. You had a business owner who wanted to give back to her community. And all of our communities have people like that, right? as a coalition, what are we doing to make sure those people are supported? And also as a coalition, how are we making sure that they are connected to the different organizations and groups and legislators that are connected to our coalition? And so when we think about increasing community collaboration, if some people attended the National Coalition Academy, if you haven't, that is a game changer. The research is clear that coalitions who attend the National Coalition Academy, they just do better. And so take a look at that if you all haven't. But in the Academy, we talk about increasing collaboration and really taking a strategic approach in doing that. And the different components of increasing community collaboration is outreach and networking, general health and safety activities, community education and training, capacity building, the coalition's capacity to collaborate, the branding communications of the coalitions, and also overall public awareness of substance use and related issues. So as a coalition, we're trying to collaborate with organizations, people, and/or influencers who do these things, because with that type of collaboration, we can really set in motion the different organizations and people that we would need in order to employ the strategic strategies, interventions to reduce the substance use, misuse, and other related health issues. So just to run through this stuff, for some of you all, you already know this. So it's a review, and for some, it's new. So feel free to ask questions. Brittany will stop me. And so when we think about outreach and networking as a coalition, and coalition work is very much thinking ahead, very much proactive. That's our work, prevention, being proactive. And so what we encourage coalitions to be doing and thinking about every year, and even depending on how your coalition is structured, each quarter we're thinking about, all right, what outreach or networking do we need to do to stay connected with grassroots organizations, with agency stakeholders that have a mutual benefit in what we're trying to achieve, and also what the community concerns are. So what is our goals in outreach and networking? So I've seen coalitions during this time, when we think about the racial incidents, beginning to have sessions or town hall meetings where they would schedule several town hall meetings where community members can come in and talk and express their opinions, and the coalition members are able to get agency stakeholders and even politicians to the table, right? To really facilitate that outreach and networking. Other thing when we think about increasing community collaborations is public awareness of substance use and misuse. We know that culture plays a big role in how people think, use, and misuse substances. And so are we talking about that? Are we sharing that information? Are we sharing that information to the communities within communities? And we know that different demographics have different patterns in which they use substances. So do we provide that information? Are we making sure people know that? But also, what are the risk factors when we think about what increases that use? Coalition communication and branding. And so what I've seen across the country, and also coalitions that we support internationally, one, because of the pandemic, coalition branding has gotten a lot better. So kudos to you all. Another thing that I've seen what coalitions do is begin to have the conversation about, if they haven't already, about racial injustice. And what's interesting is the coalitions who have been having these conversations are the coalitions that have youth, have a youth committee, or they're connected to a youth coalitions, and the youths are pushing this conversation, right? And so if I'm a coalition leader, how do I support the youth? because they're not the only ones having this conversation, but making sure they're connected to other people. And but also, how do we express this in what we communicate, how we communicate, and showing that we're here to support the community depending on the community concern. From there, community education and training, there have been coalitions across the country who've started doing some implicit bias training. Coalitions have asked us to do some cultural competency training. And so as a coalition, are you providing those opportunities for your coalition members? And or are you providing those opportunities for community members? Some coalitions I've known in the state of Tennessee have really partnered with other community organizations to have these conversations and have people as guest speakers to talk about racial injustice. And so again, as a coalition, are we tapping into our networks and providing the education and training people need in order to even begin to have the conversation, right? Sometimes people with anything, people don't have the language and or the knowledge to have the conversation in a sophisticated way. And so are we doing that as a coalition, and how are we thinking about that? General health and safety related activities, we know that we fall under the public health model, and the public health model is very much about community health. And so as a coalition, we are definitely always supporting and assisting with any healthy activities, any forms of communication. And so if we know that certain communities within communities are facing certain types of conditions, as a coalition, what are we doing to inform people, but also push the conversation in a way where our communities have the ability to be more healthy and given the agency that they need in order to make those decisions to be more healthy. Building coalition capacity to collaborate. We know that there are some coalition members that does not need to be talking to anybody else. It's the truth. Some people just, they're good at what they do there, but they are not the spokesperson for the coalition. And what we have to think about as a coalition is, one, who's going to be our people, who are going to be our ambassadors, and also as a coalition, how do we increase the capacity for us to sustain a high level of collaborative efforts with various different organizations with all shapes, with all different shapes and sizes. And so as a coalition, are we giving our members the skills to collaborate? And also from an organizational standpoint, from a structure standpoint, how are we maintaining those collaborative and or MOUs of partnerships and strategic interventions where we are trying to apply and achieve certain goals, right? So how do we begin to think about those things in a way in which that it happens not only individually, but as a broad coalition where we're doing those things. So as we think about racial injustice, health inequalities, and what's happening in our communities, every trainer has their thing, every trainer has their thoughts. And I think the approach that I take in this work is a coalition's job is to create the opportunities in the space in which people can interact and talk through these things, and then really put things in motion as we think about trying to better our community conditions. And so one of the ways in which we can do that is helping people get to common ground. We don't have to agree with everything. We don't have to agree with the ways things should go about, but we have to agree on something. And I believe one of the roles of the coalition is to help our community members get to common ground. I see the chat box blinking, Brittany, are we okay?
Yeah, we're good. I just put the activity link in there.
Thank you. And so we're going to give you all another 10 minutes to go through this Reaching Common Ground worksheet. And so what we would want you all to do is describe a condition or incidents in which bias took place, and how did it show up in your communities. And then from there, we would ask you all to go through the steps here. Where's my mouse? Here we go. There you go. It's all white. So provide, from a community standpoint, provide the historical context. If something is happening in our communities, it's definitely connected to something. So what's the historical context? Describe the current biased experience and within the community, what happened, who was a part of it, who are the different groups that are directly and indirected by the incidents. List of various interpretations, ideas, positions. People are on the spectrum of different thoughts and ideas. So what are the ideas and perceptions and feelings that are showing up and you are hearing as a coalition? Describe all the financial, social, and political implications. What does it mean? Describe any moral dilemma from the various stakeholders involved, because law enforcement may feel some type of way. Activists feel some type of way. And so what does that mean? What does that mean? And as a coalition, again, how do we help people find common ground? What is the collaborative approach we should take? And when we think about how we increase community collaboration, and what stakeholders need to be in a room as we begin to plan and respond. So you all will be given some time to work on this worksheet. So this is a misspell right here. It's took, not tool. So that way you all are not confused. So we're gonna give you all 10 minutes to work on that.
Got about 2 more minutes.
Thank you for the music, Brittany.
This is Brittany Huffman. She's been your NPR host for the day.
That was on point. Like I thought I was listening to it. I was like, did I leave that thing on? That's great. So Karen is out here giving us the tea. And so Karen shared in the chat box, and so what I would like for you all to share in the chat box, one, was this worksheet helpful? And then two, did it help with clarity? Did it help with you all in thinking about how can you approach such incidents and ongoing fractions you may have in your community? And so let me type that in the chat box. So like I said to you all, I'm not a multitasker, so I've got to do one thing at a time. So we have Karen giving us the tea of what's going on in her chat, and talk about what she's saying here. The perceived issues Cumberland County to be that the agencies that align themselves as coalitions are guilty of mission drift, which is one. This is a lot of communities are facing this. And reply the language that meet the RFP criteria specs do not have the true capacity nor desire because they're not a part of community. They serve the data-driven, deliverable outcomes, not skill change, personnel growth driven. This is also reflective of longitudinal express exclusion, diversity, and employment. And so one of the things that, and I really appreciate that, like anything in our work as coalition leaders, we have to connect the dots. So we have to connect the dots of how certain things in our community are happening and how it intersects with certain demographics. And so the CDC has a lot of information, great information on health disparities, and helps makes those connections for communities. So I'm putting that link in a chat box. And so we know that, we also know that when it comes to use, definitely race plays and race culture plays a role. We also know that when people get the certain amount of training and are evaluated on a scale of where people are evaluating practitioners, people of different backgrounds are evaluating practitioners, then that gives institutions, practitioners a sense of what they need to improve. And so we know when we talk about training and capacity building, those things, we can begin to build that data set around if we do this, then we can see that there are positive outcomes. So we would have to help when we talk about when responding to RFPs or asking for or grants, we have to connect those dots for people. And that requires a lot. That requires your coalition in doing the work and understanding how those dots may fall and are connected. So the CDC has a lot of resources when we think about health disparities. So that link is in there. They also have one that's called Reach. Let me get that link for you all. Anyone else? And so we had Bonnie saying it was helpful to get my mind around the issue and break it down. Right. These are complex. With anything that's happening in our community, with any conditions that are happening in community, they're complex, they're loaded, and depending on who or what makes it even more complicated. And so if we can tease that stuff out and begin to think about it from the different and the different aspects or perceptions, then we can kind of start thinking about where do we fall in this, and how do we help, and how do we show up as a coalition. And so if there isn't anything else in our chat box, go back to the PowerPoint. That's all I have for you all. I'll give you all an opportunity to ask some questions, some comments, but definitely feel free to reach us here at CACA if you have any questions and any thoughts. So definitely the CACA website is full of resources. So take a look at that, start putting some things in the search box, and you'll definitely get a lot of material, especially the primers. Those are clutch, like I mentioned. Coalition development support, 1-800-54-CACA, extension 240. With any questions that you have about your coalition, you can reach out to me directly if you all want to continue the conversation and or have us come and do a training for you all. We can do that, and I can get you connected to the different trainers who are skilled in so many different things, and so that way we can assist you all in your goals in achieving population level change. And so we have a few more minutes left for questions and answers, but that's all I have for you all. I didn't want to hold you too long, but definitely use those worksheets as you all first with your staff, if you have staff, and also with your coalition leaders, and then thinking about how do we move forward. Can I get a copy of the first active? Okay, Brittany's already that. What suggestions do you get person to unpack anger about this issue constructively? Yeah, so these are one when we think about historical trauma, but also when we think about triggers, and so I think when it comes to this work, it's a multidisciplinary work, because you're not only thinking about the psychology of the person, but you're also thinking about from a sociological standpoint, political standpoint, micro and macro. And so you're really going into this in a sense of thinking about it at different levels. And your job, I think, for coalitions is focusing it, because what we can do is create a space to have these conversations, and it goes everywhere. And not to say that's a bad thing, but it can hurt the overall, it can hurt what your objectives are. And so definitely creating spaces to allow people to vent, because people need that. We all need that. And so having those spaces, and once people do get a chance to vent and share, then we can kind of maybe even think about moving forward and being more constructive. I don't think you can be constructive without those venting sessions, because people have to lament, people have to go through those things. So please do that. I can put let me put in the chat box a link on how to even facilitate some of those conversations. We have any other questions?
I haven't seen any other questions come in, but I just wanted to add, I am gathering all of these links that Colbert is putting in the chat box, and we'll make sure to put them up and link them on the website as well, where the worksheets are linked as well. So you'll be able to come back and find these links again as you're having these conversations in your community. questions or comments that people want to put in the chat box.
And for anybody who is a part of my academy with Stephanie and I or Dave, I'm letting y'all out early. So remember that. So remember that if we have to stay longer. All right. So just remember.
Oh, Crystal just put in the chat box, can you speak to the power of active listening during these conversations?
Okay. Thank you, Crystal. Great conversation. Great question. So I think, and I feel like that's a training in itself, but the don'ts is you don't want to minimize somebody's experience. You don't want to rush them. And I think you definitely want to have expectations before those conversations are had. So the rules of engagement gives people the structure in which they can have those conversations. So starting with some rules and respect, allowing people to share one person at a time, those types of rules, and it may be different for different communities. Starting there, and then as a facilitator, and that's why it's important for you all to kind of be thinking about what you're thinking and feeling, because as you're facilitating, people may say something that is triggering to you, and you can't stay there. Like you can't be in that. You have to stay present for everyone else. So doing your own work and setting up those conversations that have structure, but you don't want to minimize anyone, and you want to make sure it's everyone is keeping things appropriate, and you don't want to silence anyone, because minimizing people's experiences and silencing people is part of the problem. So just some general do's and don'ts.
Thank you.
Thank you, Crystal.
I will put the link for the evaluation in the chat box, so please be sure to complete that. And then at the end of the evaluation, you'll be able to get your certificate of attendance if you need credit hours for this. Karen had added remaining present in the midst of active listening, and facilitation allows you to give the present of change.
Thank you, Karen.
Great. Well, again, this recording will be up on the website in the next couple of days. People have already started the evaluation, so we're excited to see what people have to say. So please be sure to complete that. You'll be able to get your certificate. And Colbert, thank you so much for this webinar and for this time, and for sharing your information.
Thank you, Brittany.
For those who are CADCA members, you can head on over to the CADCA community, and we'll have a conversation over there as well. You can brainstorm a little bit with some other community members. Colbert will be there to offer some feedback as well. And again, I'll be gathering all of these links and putting them up on the webpage. And we hope to see you at a future webinar Wednesday. Thank you so much, everyone.